How would you pair countries around the world with books and bookish themes? Hello, welcome to my channel. Another Bibliophile Reads. My name is Greg. Today I'm doing Travel the World book tag. This tag was created by Cliff at Cliff's Dark Gems. This is what Cliff says about his tag. Pairing favorite places with bookish prompts. I have traveled around the world, including many countries not mentioned in this video. For this tag, I have tried to connect some of my favorite countries with a reason why they are special, with related bookish prompts. There are 10 prompts to this video. It is not absolutely necessary to pair the book location with the location of the prompt. Number 1, UK and Republic of Ireland, known for history, culture, arts, and literature. Talk about an older book, classic, that you have read and loved. I want to talk about Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This is my favorite 19th century English novel. It is a story of Jude Folly, an orphan who wants to study for the religious life. But as an orphan, he's not eligible for that study. So he's forced into a rather peculiar world where he becomes a stone carver. He makes a very bad marriage choice early on, and that sort of wrecks his life when he later falls in love with a different woman, but can't marry her because he's already married. This is the novel that got Thomas Hardy in trouble. There was a hue and cry when Thomas Hardy published this book because they considered it obscene. They considered it blasphemous because Jude falls in love with a woman. They have a relationship outside of marriage, and that was too scandalous for its day and age. But I'm drawn to Jude. I can understand Jude. I can understand his aspirations to be something more than just a poor orphan, but never rising above his situation. This is a very dark and gloomy book. It is very depressing in most people's opinion, but I am absolutely fascinated by this book. It would make it into my top 5 novels of all time. Number 2, Australia. Beautiful country with wildlife found nowhere else on earth. Talk about a book that has an original and unique premise. I want to talk about A Void by Georges Perec. This is a novel translated from the French. In the original French, it was a lipogram. And a lipogram is a form of writing where the author deliberately suppresses a letter in the alphabet, so you have to write the book without using that letter. He chose the letter E in French. In French, the letter E is the most common letter in the language. So he had to write an entire book without using that letter. And that means you just don't use words with that letter. You just can't not use the letter or skip over the letter. It has to be a word that does not contain the letter E. This book was translated into English by Albert Gilder or Gabler, something like that. I'll put it in the notes right below this screen. He translated it into English, again as a lipogram, not using the letter E. Same rules apply. He just cannot use words that contain the letter E. So you cannot have the, you cannot have love, you cannot have sex. So he just had to use words without the letter E. Now that makes this a very loose translation. I would even say this translation is more inspired by the original. I think some of the characters are roughly the same, but it's not exactly the same. And there really is not much of a plot to talk about. When I first read this book in my 30s, I was captivated. I thought it was one of the most magnificent things I had ever read. And then in my late 50s, I reread it and I said, what was my younger self thinking? It's a fascinating book to read. Reading pages without the letter E is interesting. And if you don't know he's not using the letter E, you may not catch on for a dozen or so pages. You may think, this style is so peculiar. Why is he writing like that? Well, he's writing like that because he's not using the letter E. But your brain may not catch on. And that's why I found it so fascinating at 30. But in my mid-50s, as I said, I just was not impressed as much as I was. But this is a book that I think a lot of people would find fascinating. Prompt number 3, New Zealand, a land of breathtaking beauty. Talk about a book, fiction or nonfiction, where the setting, real or imaginary, is so stunning you want to live there. By the very nature of this question, I think it's pushing people to a wilderness, a country setting, something uncivilized, unset. But for me, if I had to choose one place on the earth where I would like to live, it would be an urban setting. It would be the Champs-Élysées in Paris, France. At my heart, I think I'm an urbanite, but I've never actually got to live in a city for an extended period of time. I guess that's unfortunate. So now I have to think about something set in Paris, France, along the Champs-Élysées, and I've decided to pick A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. This is his memoir of the 20s after World War I, when he was an expatriate living in France. It was published in 1964 posthumously. But this is a fascinating story. You get to meet all sorts of fascinating characters like F. Scott Fitzgerald. So that's the book that I would choose in the location I would really like to live in. Prompt number 4, France, Paris, City of Love. Talk about a book that you enjoyed where a love story is either central to the plot or just present in the story. This does not have to be a romance or erotica novel. Last month, or was it 2 months ago, I read Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I had never read this book before. I was under the impression that it was going to be a romance novel, although people kept telling me it's not really a romance novel, but that persisted in my mind. Wuthering Heights was going to be a romance novel. And then I finally read it. It's not a romance novel. There is definitely a love story between Catherine and Heathcliff, and it is a dark, twisted, maybe even macabre love story. And that's what really drew me in, because it's this twisted nature of love that's unearthly. I guess unearthly isn't quite right, but inhuman in some ways. That's how twisted this relationship is. And I loved the setting. It was amazing that a woman in her 30s could write such a sophisticated novel. As I was doing some research about the novel while reading it, I learned that the critics of the time said this book had to be written by a man because Emily Bronte originally published under a pseudonym, and it was more common for women to publish under male pseudonyms than their real name back then. But Wuthering Heights, what a twisted love story. I really liked it. Prompt number 5, Germany, Oktoberfest, the world's largest beer festival. Name and talk about a book where wild celebrations and crazy parties are part of the storyline. Yeah, I could mention that Jazz Age novel published in the United States that so many people will probably mention in this prompt, but I wanted to give something just a little bit different. I'm going to pick The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Okay, technically, this is a short story and not a book, but let's stretch some things. This is the story of a prince who throws a wild and magnificent party in the time of a plague, the Red Death. And they were under the assumption that this party, this prince, they would be immune to the plague. Go ahead and read this story. What a wild party. What a wild story. Number 6, Mexico. Tourism and beaches. Name and talk about a book set on the coast or an island. One of my good friends who just did this tag picked Jaws by Peter Benchley. that was going to be my choice, Amity Island. But since it was already picked, and there's really no rule against me picking the same book, I'm going to go with something just a little bit different. This is The Island by Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley is more famously known for his magnificent dystopian novel, Brave New World. But The Island is Huxley's attempt to create a utopia. It is set more or less in our world where there is an island nation that is excluded from the rest of the world. People are not supposed to be visiting it. It is a utopia, a paradise. And a British man is sent to this island to sort of infiltrate it, learn what's going on this island. And as I was reading this, I kept asking myself, is this truly a utopia? Because I did not see it as a utopia, but this is Huxley's idea of what he thinks a utopia might be or could be. Or was he really trying for something more in depth to get us to think about the nature of utopias? And maybe a utopia is actually impossible, that no one is going to like a utopia, or not everyone will like it, because our opinions, what we enjoy, what we value, may not be included with any other people's or all other people's values of what they think it should be. Prompt number 7, Italy, cuisine, fine food, and wine. Talk about a book, fiction or nonfiction, where food and or drink is central to the plot. I'm going to have to make a confession here. I'm not much of a foodie. My life does not revolve around food. I don't think about food all that much. I don't read a lot of books about food. My wife, however, is a little bit different. She can pick up a cookbook or two and peruse through the pages and just lost in a world, in her mind, imagining foods on the pages turning into food on a plate in front of her. But this creates sort of a problem for me. What type of book should I talk about with food? I'm going to do a stretcher here. I'm going to break the rules just a little bit. Mostly because Cliff is famously known for really loving the horror genre. And I have no horror books on this list. So I'm going to add a horror book about cannibalism. I want to talk about The Flesh Eaters by L.A. Morse. This is a novel from the 70s. It is a historical novel of horror set in the 16th century, 17th century, somewhere around there in Scotland. And at that time, there were rumors to be a cannibal tribe living in the hills, or whatever they have in Scotland. And this cannibal family would waylay travelers, kill them, and eat them. So I guess it is about food somewhat in this book. Is it a great horror novel? Well, it's not going to be the best horror novel in the world, but it was fun. It's gruesome. It is almost certainly completely out of print. Paperback copies will cost you an arm and a leg, which you may have to eat afterwards. But the Kindle version is only 99 cents. So if you want to read a horror book about cannibalism, The Flesh Eaters by L.A. Morse is a winner. Prompt number 8, Austria, alpine landscapes, ski, snowboard. Talk about a book where a sport, contest, real or imagined, is a central focus of the story. Mountain climbing is a sport. Isn't it? Well, I'm picking Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. Jon Krakauer is a journalist, and before he became a journalist, he was a semi-professional mountain climber, if you can think of mountain climbing as a profession. But he was near the top of mountain climbers, and he was working for Outside Magazine, and he was assigned to report on the climbs being done on Mount Everest. There were groups that were taking inexperienced mountain climbers to the top of Mount Everest, and Outside Magazine said, go do a story about that. Krakauer says, No, I won't just do a story. I'm actually going to climb Mount Everest with this group and report on that. And that's what he did. Except there was a tragedy on Mount Everest, and a number of the climbers perished. John Krakauer was filled with guilt after he survived this expedition. He thought, maybe I could have done more to save the people who perished on the mountain. And maybe he could have. Read the book and think about it yourself. But it's also an examination into the nature of mountain climbing. What drives a person to actually want to climb a mountain when they're not professional mountain climbers? And the people that John Krakauer is talking about in this book are mostly non-professional mountain climbers. They don't do this as professional. They do this as a minor hobby. They are inexperienced. But these groups that you paid a lot of money for, I think it was like $50,000 back in the 90s to get to the top of Mount Everest. That's a lot of money to be led to the top of Mount Everest. So this book is completely fascinating. I originally read this book late 90s, shortly after it's published, and my thought was, hell no, I don't want to climb Mount Everest. But still, people are doing it, even after the tragedy that John Krakauer explains so well in this book. Into Thin Air may be one of my favorite nonfiction works of all time. Number 9, South Africa, The Rainbow Nation. Talk about a book from a diverse author that you have enjoyed. Race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, anything. I am picking Native Son by Richard Wright. I first read this book in the late 80s. It is the story of Bigger Thomas, a young African American in Chicago during the 30s. He is given a job opportunity that many people in his situation would absolutely want. He is working in the house of a very rich Caucasian family. But one of his duties is to drive their wild daughter around the city. And he takes the wild daughter out. He meets with her communist boyfriend, and he takes her back to the house. She is drunk as a skunk, as the saying goes, and he tries to get her into her bedroom without awakening the rest of the family. Something unfortunate happens. He tries to keep her silent as she's waking up and accidentally smothers her to death. So what is a young African American boy supposed to do with a dead Caucasian girl in the bedroom that he's not supposed to be in? Well, he takes it down to the coal furnace in the basement and disposes of the body. Well, let's just say things don't get any better for him after that. But what makes this novel truly amazing is that even though Bigger Thomas has created or done a heinous crime, you feel for him. You feel for this pressure crushing him, trying to escape, trying to make sure that he is not punished for his deed. And it gets worse and worse for him as the novel goes on. He tries to get involved with the communists, and the communists are sort of helpful, sort of not. Now, Richard Wright was a communist sympathizer back in the 30s. If you read his later novel, The Outsider, Richard Wright thoroughly disowns his communist past, as he probably should have. But Native Son is just a fantastic novel, however you want to look at it. Prompt number 10, bonus prompt. Where do you live? Country, state. Choose and talk about a book, fiction or nonfiction, that reflects the culture, history, and anything else of your home. Well, I essentially live in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Technically, I'm just outside the city, across the Rappahannock River. If you know your Civil War history, there was a very important battle fought in Fredericksburg in 1864. It is one of the major battles of the American Civil War. And the book I am recommending is A Worse Place Than Hell: How the Civil War Battle of Fredericksburg Changed a Nation by John Matson. I have talked about this book a number of times before because I live here, and it's an excellent look at history and the American Civil War. The book follows five people. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who eventually would survive and become a Supreme Court justice. There was a one-eyed army chaplain named Arthur Fuller, who I'd never heard of before reading this book. There is Walt Whitman, one of America's most famous poets. There was Louisa May Alcott, who would go on to write Little Women, a very famous and popular book. And then there is John Pelham. He was a Southern artilleryman who I'd never heard of before reading this book. This is an excellent work of narrative nonfiction. You get to know the stories of these five people very well, and you will probably be very engaged and learn a little bit of my local history. Okay, tag some people. I think Cliff tagged a lot of the people I know, so I'm going to tag Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics, MJ at Reading This Life, and Brian at Bookish. Thank you for watching and keep on reading.